The screaming started at 3:47 a.m., and Tavian knew immediately that the perimeter had been breached. He bolted upright in the converted warehouse that had become home to 43 survivors, his heart hammering against his ribs like a desperate prisoner. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in crimson, and for a moment, just a fleeting second, Tavian wondered if this was how it would end, not with hope, but with blood and darkness. "Northeast corner," someone shouted, their voice cracking with terror. Tavian recognized it as young Dashiell, barely 19, who'd been on watch. The boy had seen things no teenager should ever witness, and yet he'd volunteered for the most dangerous shift. That was the thing about survival, it aged you in ways that had nothing to do with years. Tavian grabbed his reinforced bat, the one with the nails driven through at precise angles, and ran toward the commotion. His bare feet slapped against cold concrete as he navigated the maze of makeshift sleeping quarters. Around him, others were rising, reaching for weapons, pulling on boots, their faces masks of controlled panic. They'd drilled for this. They'd prepared. But preparation and reality were two different beasts entirely. Mireille was already at the breach point when Tavian arrived, her medical bag slung across her shoulder, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She'd been a trauma surgeon before the outbreak, and now she was their lifeline. Her eyes met Tavian's, and in that glance, he saw the calculation happening behind them, how many injured they could handle, how much medical supply they had left, how many they might lose tonight. "How many?" Tavian asked, his voice steadier than he felt. 7 visible, Kofi answered, appearing from the shadows like a mountain-given human form. The man had been a construction worker, and his arms were thick as tree trunks, his hands scarred from 1,000 close calls. He carried a sledgehammer that few others could even lift. But you know there's always more where those came from. The zombies pressed against the chain-link fence, their gray flesh mottled and torn, mouths opening and closing in an obscene parody of hunger. They didn't scream or roar like in the movies. They were silent, save for the wet sounds of their movements and the rattling of the fence. Somehow, that silence was worse than any sound could have been. "The fence won't hold," Sylvain said, joining their impromptu council of war. She was thin as a rail, her dark eyes constantly moving, constantly analyzing. She'd been a chess champion before the world ended, and she approached every problem like it was a game with lethal consequences. "They're pushing at a weak point. The supports we installed last week, they're not properly reinforced. I told Renzo we needed more time." "We didn't have more time," Renzo shot back, arriving with a toolkit in hand and oil smeared across his forehead. The engineer looked exhausted, as he always did, carrying the weight of keeping their infrastructure functional on his narrow shoulders. "We've been patching holes with whatever scraps we can find. This whole place is held together with prayers and rust." Tavian watched the fence bow inward, the metal screaming in protest. Behind the first wave of zombies, he could see more shambling out of the darkness, drawn by some instinct he couldn't fathom. Dozens of them. Maybe more. The horde had been growing over the past weeks, and their sanctuary, this warehouse district on the outskirts of what used to be Seattle, was looking less like a refuge and more like a tomb. "We need to make a decision," Tavian said, and everyone turned to look at him. He hadn't asked to be a leader. He'd been an insurance adjuster, for God's sake, someone who calculated risk on paper. But when civilization crumbled, people looked for anyone who could provide direction, and somehow he'd become that person. "We can't fight them all. Not head-on." "Then what do you suggest?" Mireille asked, her voice tight. Tavian looked at each of them in turn, Kofi with his strength, Sylvain with her tactics, Renzo with his ingenuity, Mireille with her skills. Alone, they were vulnerable. Together, they were something else entirely. "We do what humans do best," he said quietly. "We work together, and we survive." The fence gave way with a shriek of tortured metal exactly 4 minutes later. Tavian had known it would happen, had seen it in the way the posts were tilting, in the gathering weight of bodies pressing against the barrier. What he hadn't anticipated was how fast it would go, one moment standing, the next moment a gaping wound in their defenses with death pouring through. "Fall back to position 2. Sylvain's voice cut through the chaos, high and clear. They'd established fallback positions weeks ago, mapping out the warehouse's interior into defensive zones. It had seemed paranoid at the time, obsessive even, but now Tavian sent a silent prayer of thanks for Sylvain's meticulous nature. The survivors moved with surprising coordination, each person knowing their role. Lucienne, who at 72 was the oldest among them, shepherded the children toward the reinforced safe room at the warehouse's center. Her hands shook with palsy, but her voice remained iron-hard, brooking no argument. She'd survived a war in her youth, somewhere in Eastern Europe, and she carried that survivor's steel in her bones. Kofi took position at the main choke point, where the warehouse floor narrowed between 2 support pillars. He'd wanted this spot specifically, had argued for it during their planning sessions. "A strong man in a narrow space is worth 10 men in an open field," he'd said, and now Tavian understood the wisdom of it. The sledgehammer swung in brutal arcs, and zombies fell like wheat before a scythe. But there were so many. For every one that Kofi dropped, 2 more shambled forward, climbing over their fallen companions without hesitation or awareness. They felt no fear, no pain, no exhaustion. They were hunger given form, and they were relentless. "Renzo, we need the traps active now," Tavian shouted over the growing din. They'd spent precious resources building a series of mechanical traps, but they'd been saving them, worried about wasting materials. That caution seemed foolish now, with death literally at their door. The engineer's fingers flew over a jury-rigged control panel, switches flipping in rapid succession. There was a moment of terrible silence, and Tavian's heart sank. Had the traps failed? Had they put their faith in machines that wouldn't deliver? Then the floor erupted. Sections of concrete dropped away, revealing pits lined with sharpened rebar. Zombies tumbled into the darkness, impaled on the spikes below. Trip wires activated, releasing weighted nets that tangled groups of the creatures. A makeshift flamethrower, constructed from propane tanks and copper piping, roared to life, turning a cluster of zombies into shambling torches. "It's working!" Dashiell cried out, a fierce joy in his young voice. The boy was stationed on an elevated platform, using a hunting rifle to pick off zombies that got too close to their defenders. His hands had stopped shaking after the first shot, Tavian noticed. Trauma either broke you or forged you into something harder. Mireille moved through the organized chaos like a dancer, reaching wounded survivors before they even realized they'd been injured. Her hands worked with practiced efficiency, pressure here, bandage there, antibiotics distributed with careful precision. Every bite meant death, slow and agonizing, but scratches could be treated, and blood loss could be stopped. She was fighting her own war against death, one patient at a time. Sylvain stood beside Tavian, her eyes tracking the flow of battle like a general surveying a battlefield. "They're concentrating on the northeast breach," she observed, her voice clinically detached despite the carnage. "If we can redirect some of the pressure to the western corridor, we might." "We might split our forces too thin," Tavian interrupted, but he was already considering the possibility. That was Sylvain's gift, She saw angles others missed, connections that weren't obvious. But if we could lure a portion of them away from Kofi's position, he could advance and close the breach temporarily. Exactly. Sylvain's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. We'll need noise and light. Something to draw them. Tavian nodded, making the decision even as his gut clenched with fear. I'll do it. Dashiell, give me covering fire. Renzo, I need something that makes noise, lots of it. The engineer didn't hesitate, pulling a modified car alarm from his seemingly bottomless toolkit. 45 seconds of sound, then it dies. Make it count. Tavian took the device, feeling its weight in his palm. 45 seconds to draw away enough zombies to make a difference. 45 seconds to potentially save them all, or to die trying. He looked at the faces around him, Kofi holding the line with raw strength, Mireille saving lives with skilled hands, Sylvain orchestrating their defense with brilliant tactics, Renzo providing the tools they needed to survive, Dashiell finding courage in the midst of terror, Lucienne protecting their future by guarding the young. This was what humanity had been reduced to, and somehow, it was also humanity at its finest. They were a team, each person essential, each contribution vital. Let's show these dead bastards what determination looks like, Tavian said, and ran into the darkness. The car alarm wailed like a banshee, its piercing shriek cutting through the warehouse's cavernous space. Tavian held it above his head, running parallel to the main zombie surge, his lungs burning as he pushed his body to its limits. Behind him, he could hear the wet shuffling of feet as the creatures changed direction, drawn by the irresistible lure of sound. It was working. God help him, it was actually working. 30 seconds. Renzo's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie at Tavian's belt. They'd salvaged a few from a camping store months ago, and they'd become lifelines in situations exactly like this. Tavian's legs pumped, carrying him deeper into the western section of the warehouse, toward an area they deliberately left more open. The plan was simple: lure the zombies away, give Kofi room to operate, then escape through a prepared route back to the defensive positions. Simple in theory. Potentially fatal in execution. 20 seconds. The horde behind him was growing. Tavian could hear them, could feel them in the way the air seemed to thicken with their presence. He didn't dare look back. Looking back meant slowing down, and slowing down meant death. 10 seconds. He could see his escape route ahead, a ladder leading to a catwalk that the zombies' deteriorating motor skills couldn't navigate. Just another 30 feet. 20. 10. The alarm died with a pathetic wheeze, plunging the warehouse into relative quiet. Tavian's hands found the ladder rungs, and he climbed with desperate speed, his shoulders screaming in protest. Below him, the zombies gathered, their dead eyes staring upward, hands reaching toward him with mindless persistence. Status, he gasped into the walkie-talkie, his chest heaving. Kofi's advancing. Sylvain responded, her voice tight with concentration. He's using shipping containers to create a temporary wall. It's working, Tavian. Your distraction gave us the opening we needed. From his elevated position, Tavian could see the battlefield with new clarity. The warehouse floor resembled a nightmare version of chess, with living and dead pieces moving in complex patterns. Kofi was indeed repositioning two heavy shipping containers, his massive strength allowing him to push them into place where 3 normal men would have struggled. The containers would create a bottleneck, limiting the zombie advance to a manageable trickle. But the horde Tavian had drawn away was now trapped below him, and more were arriving every moment. He'd succeeded in the immediate goal but had created a new problem. He was isolated, cut off from the main group, with dozens of zombies between him and safety. I'm stuck, he admitted, watching the dead mass below him with growing dread. I can't get back without leading them straight to our position. There was a moment of static-filled silence. Then Mireille's voice came through, uncharacteristically emotional. Don't do anything stupid. We'll find a way to extract you. No. Tavian's voice was firm. You need everyone in defensive positions. I knew the risks. And I know that we don't abandon our people. This from Kofi, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. We're a team. That means all of us survive, or none of us do. Tavian felt something hot and unexpected sting his eyes. When had he last cried? He couldn't remember. Emotions had seemed like a luxury in the months since the outbreak, something to be suppressed in favor of cold survival instinct. But hearing Kofi's unwavering declaration cracked something inside him. The western skylights, Sylvain said suddenly. Renzo, can we access them from the maintenance corridor? Yes, but, the engineer paused, and Tavian could almost hear his mind working. Yes. Yes, we can. Tavian, there's a skylight directly above your position. If we can open it, you can climb onto the roof and traverse back to the main building. The manual override is rusted shut, Renzo continued, his words tumbling out in an excited rush. But if Kofi can reach the mechanism, he has the strength to force it. Tavian, can you climb? Tavian looked up. The ceiling seemed impossibly far away, but he could make out the dark square of the skylight amid the corrugated metal roof. I can climb, he confirmed. Then we have a plan. Sylvain's voice carried the satisfaction of a chess player seeing a winning move. But we need to coordinate perfectly. Timing is everything. What followed was a masterclass in teamwork under pressure. Kofi fought his way through the thinning zombie presence near the breach, his sledgehammer singing its brutal song. Renzo guided him via walkie-talkie through the labyrinthine maintenance corridors, his engineer's knowledge of the building proving invaluable. Dashiell provided covering fire from his sniper's perch, each shot carefully placed to clear Kofi's path. Mireille coordinated the other survivors, ensuring the defensive positions remained strong while their strongest fighter was temporarily away. She moved people like pieces on a board, following Sylvain's called-out instructions, creating a living barrier against the zombie tide. And Lucienne, despite her age and trembling hands, took up a position at a crucial junction, a homemade spear gripped in her weathered palms. When a zombie broke through toward the safe room, she didn't hesitate. The spear took it through the eye socket with the precision of someone who'd learned long ago that survival sometimes required violence. I'm at the override. Kofi's voice boomed through the walkie-talkie. It's worse than rusted, it's practically welded shut by corrosion. Can you force it? Tavian asked, watching the zombies below him with growing anxiety. They weren't leaving. They never left. There was a moment of silence, filled only with the sound of Kofi's labored breathing. Then came a groan of protesting metal, a shriek of moving parts that hadn't moved in years, and finally, triumphantly, it's opening. Above Tavian's head, the skylight began to slide back, revealing the night sky beyond. The night air hit Tavian's face like a benediction as he pulled himself through the skylight, his muscles trembling from exertion and adrenaline. The warehouse roof stretched before him, a landscape of corrugated metal and shadows, and for a moment he simply lay there, chest heaving, staring at the stars that had witnessed humanity's fall. I'm out, he gasped into the walkie-talkie. I'm on the roof. Thank God, Mireille breathed, and Tavian heard genuine relief in her voice. It reminded him that they weren't just survivors thrown together by circumstance, they'd become something more. A family forged in the crucible of apocalypse. Don't celebrate yet, Sylvain cautioned. Tavian, you need to traverse east about 40 meters. There's a roof access door that leads back into the main building, into our secured territory. Can you see it? Tavian pushed himself to his feet, scanning the roofline. The door was there, exactly where Sylvain said it would be, a darker rectangle against the dark roof. I see it. Then move. We've got a situation developing down here. Those words sent ice through Tavian's veins. He started moving, feet careful on the treacherous surface, but his mind was below with his people. What situation? The breach is bigger than we thought. Renzo's voice this time, tight with worry. The zombies didn't just break through the fence, they've been digging underneath. There's a whole section of foundation compromised. We've got them coming up through the floor in 3 different locations. Tavian wanted to run, to help, but rushing on the roof meant risking a fall, and a fall meant death or worse. He forced himself to maintain steady speed, each step deliberate, even as his heart raced with urgency. Kofi, fall back to defensive position Alpha, Sylvain commanded, her tactical mind still working despite the setback. Dashiell, redirect fire to the new breach points. Renzo, can we seal those holes? Not quickly, the engineer admitted. We'd need concrete, time to set it, and we have neither. I can try to cover them with metal sheeting, but... Do it, Tavian interjected, finally reaching the access door and wrenching it open. Buy us any time you can. Every second counts. He descended into chaos. The warehouse interior had transformed into a maze of desperate last stands, with survivors clustered in groups, fighting off zombies that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. The creatures emerged from floor openings like nightmarish plants growing in fast forward, their gray flesh streaked with dirt from their underground approach. Tavian dropped into the fray, his nail-studded bat finding immediate purpose. There was no time for fear, no room for hesitation. A zombie lunged at him, and he swung, felt the impact travel up his arms, saw the creature fall. Another took its place. Then another. We can't sustain this, someone shouted, Marcus, maybe, or Valeria, he couldn't tell anymore, couldn't distinguish individual voices in the cacophony. But then he heard Lucienne, her elderly voice cutting through the panic like a blade. Yes, we can. We've survived this long, we'll survive longer. Stand your ground. And somehow, impossibly, people rallied. The old woman's defiance became infectious, spreading through the defenders like wildfire. If she could stand firm at 72, with trembling hands and aging bones, then they could too. Kofi appeared beside Tavian like an avenging angel, his sledgehammer working in tandem with Tavian's bat. They didn't need to communicate verbally, they'd fought together enough times to understand each other's rhythms, to know when to strike and when to dodge, to move like 2 parts of a single organism. The children. Mireille's voice, sharp with alarm. Tavian's head snapped around. One of the floor breaches had opened near the safe room, and zombies were spilling out dangerously close to where Lucienne guarded the youngest survivors. The old woman stood her ground, spear ready, but she was one person against many. Dashiell. Tavian roared. Safe room, now. The young sniper didn't question, didn't hesitate. He abandoned his elevated position, rifle in hand, and sprinted toward Lucienne. His shots rang out with methodical precision, 1, 2, 3, each bullet finding a target, each zombie dropping with a headshot. But his movement had left a gap in their defenses, and zombies were flooding through it. Tavian saw the weakness forming, saw how their carefully orchestrated defense was beginning to crumble, and felt a moment of true despair. They were losing. Despite their determination, despite their teamwork, they were being overwhelmed by simple numbers. The support columns. Sylvain's voice broke through his despair. Tavian, the support columns at positions C7 and C9, if we bring them down, we can collapse that entire section of the warehouse, seal off the main breach. We'll trap ourselves. Renzo protested. We'll survive, Sylvain shot back. The eastern quarter is defensible on its own. We'll lose space, but we'll live. Tavian's mind raced. Bringing down the columns meant deliberately destroying part of their sanctuary, reducing their living space by half. But Sylvain was right, a smaller, secure area was better than a large area they couldn't defend. It was triage on an architectural scale. Do it, he decided. Renzo, what do you need? Explosives, but we don't have any. Or. The engineer paused, and Tavian could practically hear his thoughts coalescing. The propane tanks. If I can cluster enough of them, create a chain reaction at the base of those columns, they're already structurally weakened from years of neglect. It might work. Might isn't good enough, someone yelled. It's what we have. Mireille snapped back. Renzo, how long do you need? 5 minutes to position the tanks. 2 minutes to set the ignition system and clear the area. 7 minutes. Kofi's voice was grim. We need to hold for 7 more minutes. Tavian met the big man's eyes and saw his own determination reflected there. 7 minutes might as well have been 7 hours. Tavian had never known time could stretch so impossibly, each second dilating into an eternity of violence and desperation. His arms burned with exhaustion, his bat rising and falling in mechanical repetition as the zombies kept coming, an endless tide of decay and hunger. Renzo moved through the battlefield like a man possessed, rolling propane tanks toward the target columns with single-minded focus. Sweat poured down his face, and his hands left bloody prints on the metal cylinders. Tavian didn't know when the engineer had been injured, but there was no time to check, no time for anything except survival. 3 minutes. Renzo shouted, positioning another tank. Mireille had abandoned her medical station, fighting alongside the others with a tire iron gripped in her surgeon's hands. Those hands, so skilled at saving lives, now dealt death with clinical efficiency. A zombie's skull caved under her strike, and she was already pivoting to the next target, her movements economical and precise. Dashiell and Lucien held the line at the safe room, an unlikely pair united by necessity. The boy's rifle barked steadily, while the old woman's spear darted forward whenever a zombie got too close. They'd developed an unspoken coordination. Dashiell handled distance threats while Lucien managed close quarters, their defensive zone a small island of security in a sea of chaos. 2 minutes. Renzo's voice had taken on a frantic edge. Sylvain fought near Tavian, her slight frame wielding a machete with surprising strength. When the columns come down, we need to retreat through the eastern corridor in single file, she said between strikes, her tactical mind still working even as her body fought for survival. Kofi leads to clear the path, then the children and Lucien, then everyone else. Tavian and I bring up the rear. Always planning, Tavian grunted, his bat connecting with a zombie's jaw and sending it spinning away. Always surviving, she corrected, and there was something almost like humor in her voice. Even now, even here, human spirit persisted. 1 minute. The warehouse had become a hell of smoke and shadows, illuminated by flickering emergency lights and small fires from their earlier defensive measures. The air was thick with the stench of death, both the moving kind and the permanent kind. Bodies littered the ground, zombies and one human who'd been bitten and had taken their own life rather than turn. Tavian tried not to look, tried not to think about the person they'd lost. Everyone fall back. Renzo screamed. 30 seconds. The survivors began their retreat, maintaining formation even as they moved. It was a fighting withdrawal, each person covering the others, no one left behind. Kofi led as Sylvain had directed, his massive frame bulldozing through any zombies that blocked the eastern corridor. Behind him, Lucien shepherded the children, her weathered hand gentle on their shoulders even as her other hand kept the spear ready. Tavian and Sylvain held the rear position, backing toward safety while keeping their weapons between the zombies and the fleeing survivors. The creatures pressed forward, sensing prey escaping, their movement becoming almost frenzied despite their typically sluggish nature. 15 seconds. Renzo had reached the detonation point, his hands working frantically at the jury-rigged ignition system. Sylvain, go. Tavian commanded. Not without you, she replied stubbornly. 10 seconds. They ran together, sprinting down the corridor as the zombies surged after them. Tavian could hear their wet breathing, could feel their presence at his back like a physical weight. His legs pumped, lungs screaming, every muscle in his body pushed beyond its limits. 5 seconds. Get down. Tavian tackled Sylvain, pulling them both behind a reinforced barrier as Renzo's voice hit 0. For a moment, nothing happened, and Tavian's heart sank. Had it failed? Had they sacrificed their position for nothing? Then the world erupted. The explosion was enormous, far larger than Tavian had anticipated. The propane tanks detonated in a cascading chain reaction, each blast feeding into the next, creating a wall of fire and force that engulfed the western section of the warehouse. The support columns, already weakened by years of neglect and the recent zombie assault, couldn't withstand the blast. They buckled, twisted, and with a groan that sounded almost alive, began to collapse. The ceiling came down in sections, massive panels of corrugated metal and concrete falling like dominoes. Zombies disappeared beneath tons of rubble, their bodies crushed instantly. The breach points were sealed under mountains of debris, the underground tunnels collapsed and impassable. The noise was apocalyptic, metal shrieking, concrete shattering, the dull thunder of impact after impact. Dust billowed through the warehouse in choking clouds, making it impossible to see or breathe. Tavian pulled his shirt over his nose and mouth, squeezed his eyes shut, and waited for the world to stop ending. When silence finally fell, it was deafening in its own way. Tavian's ears rang, and he couldn't tell if that was from the explosion or from the sudden absence of sound. Slowly, carefully, he opened his eyes. The western section of the warehouse was simply gone, replaced by a mountain of rubble. Small fires still burned in places, casting flickering light across the destruction. And between the survivors and that devastation stood a solid wall of debris, accidental, but effective. The zombies were on the other side, sealed away, no longer a threat. Sound off. Tavian croaked, his throat raw from dust and smoke. Everyone sound off. One by one, voices called out from the darkness. Kofi, his deep rumble unmistakable. Mireille, calm and steady. Dashiell, shaky but alive. Lucienne, strong despite her age. Renzo, coughing but coherent. Sylvain, already asking for a head count. They'd lost 3 people in the fighting before the collapse: Martinez, who'd been bitten, Alina, who'd been overwhelmed at a breach point, and young Chen, barely 16, who'd been in the wrong place when part of the ceiling came down early. 3 lives gone, but 40 survived. 40 survivors because they'd worked together. Because they'd trusted each other. Because determination and teamwork had proven stronger than death itself. The dawn broke gray and cold over the ruined warehouse, pale light filtering through the gaps in the damaged roof. Tavian stood at what was now their eastern perimeter, looking out at the devastation they'd wrought in the name of survival. The mountain of rubble that had saved them looked different in daylight, less like a victory and more like a monument to how close they'd come to annihilation. "We can't stay here long-term," Sylvain said, appearing beside him with her characteristic quiet approach. She'd found a clean shirt somewhere, though her face was still streaked with soot and dried blood. "The explosion will have drawn every zombie for miles. They'll come eventually." "I know." Tavian didn't take his eyes off the horizon, where he could see shambling figures in the distance, drawn inexorably toward the source of last night's noise. "How long do you think we have?" "A week if we're lucky. 3 days if we're not." She was silent for a moment, then added quietly, "We did well last night." "You led well." The compliment felt hollow. Tavian kept seeing Chen's face, the teenager's expression of surprise as the ceiling panel struck him. Kept hearing Martinez's last words before he'd put the gun to his own head. Kept remembering Alina's scream, cut suddenly short. "I got 3 people killed. You saved 40 people." Sylvain's voice was sharp. "Don't dishonor the dead by dismissing the living. We survived because we worked together, because you made the hard calls that needed to be made. That's leadership." Before Tavian could respond, Mireille approached, her medical bag lighter than it had been. They'd used most of their supplies treating last night's wounded. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. "I need to talk to both of you. It's about Kofi." Alarm shot through Tavian. "Is he injured?" "No." "Yes. Maybe." Mireille's usual composure cracked slightly. "He was bitten. On the calf, during the fighting. He hid it until an hour ago." The words hit Tavian like a physical blow. Kofi, their strongest defender, their unshakable pillar of strength. "How long does he have?" "That's the thing, I don't know." Mireille's hands twisted together, a rare display of uncertainty. "The bite is shallow, barely broke the skin. I've cleaned it, applied every antibiotic we have. Sometimes, if the viral load is low enough and treatment is immediate, people survive. But it's rare. So rare." "What does Kofi want to do?" Sylvain asked, her tactical mind already considering scenarios. "He wants to isolate himself. Says he won't risk turning around the others, especially the children." Mireille's voice caught. "He's asking for a gun. Just in case." Tavian closed his eyes. The choice was impossible: confine their strongest fighter during their most vulnerable time, or risk him turning into the very thing they fought against. There was no good answer, only degrees of terrible. "I'll talk to him," Tavian said finally. He found Kofi in a storage room they'd hastily converted into an isolation chamber. The big man sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his sledgehammer resting beside him. The bite on his calf was bandaged with Mireille's characteristic precision, but Tavian could see the edges of inflamed skin, the redness that might mean infection or might mean something far worse. "You don't have to say anything," Kofi rumbled when he saw Tavian. "I know the risks. I've accepted them." "Have you?" Tavian sat down across from him, separated by 10 feet of empty floor that suddenly felt like a canyon. "Because accepting death doesn't seem like you." "I'm not accepting death. I'm accepting responsibility." Kofi's hands were steady as he checked the pistol Mireille had reluctantly provided. "If I turn, I become a threat. I won't do that to our people." "Our people," Tavian repeated. "You hear yourself? You're one of us, Kofi. We don't give up on our own. Even when giving up is the smart play." The big man's smile was sad. "You're thinking like a survivor, Tavian. You need to think like a leader. The group matters more than the individual." "That's bullshit and you know it." Tavian leaned forward, intensity crackling through his voice. "We survived last night because every individual mattered. Because we didn't leave anyone behind. Because we worked together. You taught me that when you insisted on coming back for me on the roof." Kofi was quiet for a long moment. "That was different." "How? How was that different?" "You weren't infected. We don't know that you are either." Tavian stood, began pacing. "Mireille said there's a chance. A small one, but a chance. Are you really going to give up on that?" "I'm being realistic." "You're being fatalistic." Tavian stopped, looked directly at his friend. "We've lost too many people already. I'm not losing you too. Not without a fight. Not without giving you every possible chance." The conviction in his voice seemed to surprise Kofi. The big man studied Tavian for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 72 hours. If I show no symptoms after 72 hours, Mireille thinks I might be clear. But Tavian, if I start to turn, you have to promise me you'll end it. Don't let me become one of them." "I promise," Tavian said, though the words tasted like ash. The next 3 days were the longest of Tavian's life. While the other survivors worked to fortify their reduced territory, to scout for supplies and plan their eventual evacuation, he spent every spare moment outside Kofi's isolation chamber. Sometimes they talked, about life before the outbreak, about hopes for whatever future might exist. Sometimes they sat in silence, the companionship of presence enough. Dashiell often joined him, the young man having formed a bond with Kofi during their defense of the warehouse. Lucienne came too, telling stories from her youth in a voice that never wavered, giving Kofi something to focus on besides his own mortality. Renzo brought engineering puzzles to solve, problems to keep Kofi's mind sharp. Sylvain played chess with him through the isolation chamber's window, using hand signals to move pieces on their separate boards. And Mireille checked his vital signs every 6 hours, her professional mask hiding whatever fear or hope she felt. The bite wound's redness gradually faded. Kofi's temperature remained normal. No tremors, no confusion, no signs of the virus taking hold. 72 hours after the bite, Mireille ran a final examination. Her hands were steady as she checked Kofi's pupils, his reflexes, his cognitive function. The entire community gathered outside the isolation chamber, holding a collective breath. Finally, Mireille stepped back. "You're clear," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "Against all odds, you're clear." The cheer that went up rattled the warehouse's damaged walls. Kofi emerged from isolation to be mobbed by survivors who'd become family, their joy a brief bright spot in the darkness of their situation. But as Tavian watched the celebration, he couldn't shake a growing unease. The horde in the distance had grown larger. Their supplies were running critically low. And he'd received a radio transmission that morning on an old emergency frequency, a garbled message about a safe zone, coordinates that seemed too good to be true, a voice that might have been human or might have been hope leading them into a trap. They'd won this battle through determination and teamwork. But the war was far from over. The decision to leave came easier than Tavian expected. The warehouse that had been their sanctuary was now a damaged shell, and the zombie horde gathering on the horizon made staying a death sentence. The radio transmission offered the only hope they had, coordinates pointing to a place called Haven's Ridge, supposedly a fortified settlement in the mountains. It could be a trap, Sylvain warned during their final planning session. "We'd be moving 40 people, including children, across hostile territory toward a destination we can't verify. And staying here definitely gets us killed," Kofi countered. He'd regained his strength quickly after his recovery, though Tavian noticed a new thoughtfulness in his eyes, as if his brush with death had changed him in subtle ways. "At least movement gives us a chance." "Mireille?" Tavian asked, seeking the doctor's input. "We're out of antibiotics, low on bandages, and down to 3 days of food." Her voice was clinical, but her hands trembled slightly as she counted off their dwindling resources. "From a medical standpoint, we can't sustain our current situation. We need to find more supplies or find safety. Preferably both." The vote was unanimous. They would leave at dawn. The night before their departure, Tavian couldn't sleep. He walked the perimeter of their reduced territory, checking defenses one last time, saying silent goodbye to the place that had kept them alive. He found Lucienne sitting near the eastern wall, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, staring at nothing. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, settling down beside her. "At my age, you learn that sleep is overrated." Her eyes, roomy but sharp, fixed on him. "You're worried about tomorrow." "I'm terrified," he admitted. "What if I'm leading them to their deaths? What if this safe zone doesn't exist? What if it does?" Lucienne's weathered hand found his, squeezed with surprising strength. "I survived a war because I kept moving forward. The moment you stop, the moment you give in to fear, you're already dead. You've given these people something precious, you've given them hope and purpose. Don't underestimate what that's worth. 3 people died under my leadership. And 40 live because of it. You can't save everyone, Tavian. You can only do your best and accept that sometimes, your best isn't enough." She was quiet for a moment. "I won't make it to Haven's Ridge, you know." "Don't say that. I'm not being pessimistic, just realistic. I'm 72, and every day is borrowed time." She smiled, and it was gentle. "But I'll walk as far as these old legs carry me, and I'll protect our children until my last breath. That's enough for me. Dawn came too quickly. The survivors assembled with their meager possessions, weapons, supplies, a few precious personal items salvaged from lives that no longer existed. 40 people, bound together by shared trauma and mutual dependence, ready to walk into an unknown that might save them or kill them. Dashiell took point as their scout, his young eyes sharp and his instincts honed by months of survival. Kofi and Tavian flanked the group, providing protection on either side. Renzo had fashioned crude carts to carry their supplies, reducing the load each person had to bear. Mireille walked among them, ready to provide medical aid at a moment's notice. Sylvain maintained a mental map of their route, constantly calculating alternatives and contingencies. They moved through a world that had become alien. Seattle's outskirts, once familiar, now seemed like the bones of a dead civilization. Abandoned cars rusted on silent highways. Buildings stood empty, their windows like vacant eyes. And everywhere, the zombies wandered, aimless until some sound or movement drew their terrible attention. The first day passed without major incident, though they had to detour around 2 small hordes and Kofi was forced to quietly dispatch 3 zombies that got too close. They made camp in an old elementary school, the children's artwork still hanging on the walls, faded and haunting.